Hello, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I'm happy. My name is Mateusz Wałkowski. I'm happy to announce the following edition of another edition of Exercising Modernity. I was informed by Ola that this is already the 5th edition of Exercising Modernity. Some years ago, I didn't know the names of Barbara Brukalska and Helena Syrkus. Thanks to Małgorzata and thanks to Exercising Modernity program, I know now who Barbara Brukalska and Helena Syrkus were. And so we are guided in this our effort of Exercising Modernity program. We are guided by the idea to show that modernity was not only Bauhaus. The second point, so another idea, the second idea we want to mention is that modernity is not only about Eastern Europe imitates Western Europe, but it works and functions some other way around. And the third point is that we find the notion of modernity as a graceful and good topic for international conversation. For international conversation about both the previous 20th century, the totalitarian century, with the modernity as one of the central notions with its bright and dark sides, and also about the current challenges and current hopes and current processes we observe now, and we can combine this both 20th and 21st century. And I'm very happy I can now give the micro to Ola Janos. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure and honor to announce this panel discussion, but before I do that, I also want to invite you for tomorrow's event, tomorrow at 6:30. We also have an open lecture, and it's going to be a keynote lecture by Dr. Jacob Mikanowski on orphan memory between vanishing and forgetting in Eastern Europe. So we invite you to that event. And now, without further ado, I wanted to introduce our panelists for tonight. The title of the discussion is Barbara Brukalska and Helena Syrkus, that were already mentioned, Polish women architects and the networks of the avant-garde. And our guests tonight are Professor Dr. Regina Büttner, who, as a head of the Academy of the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation, curates and teaches the postgraduate and cross-disciplinary programs on transcultural modernism in design and architecture. And also her research interests combine cultural anthropological approaches in architecture and design studies with questions such as decolonization, critical heritage, and its mediation in teaching and curatorial practice. Very happy to have you. We also have Dr. Anke Blum, who is a curator and research associate at the Bauhaus Museum, Klassik Stiftung Weimar, Germany. And as a research associate at the Bauhaus Museum, she developed several Bauhaus exhibitions, including the recent show on Bauhaus and National Socialism. And the conversation will be also moderated by Aleksandra Kędziorek, who is an art historian, curator, and editor based in Warsaw. She works at the intersection of architecture, design, and visual arts, and uses her skills in historical research to curate projects that bring inspiration from the past into contemporary debates. We are very happy to have you, and the floor is yours.
Have your seats. Thank you so much. So I was already mentioned, the title of the discussion brings two specific names, Barbara Brukalska and Helena Syrkus, but I will take the liberty of zooming in and zooming out. So we will mention them a lot, but we will also mention many other women architects and women designers to see not only Polish scene, but also to see what happened in the region, because I think it's very interesting and important to to see now this broader landscape, and it seems also it's a very good time to discuss those things. Yes, I just recently was in Warsaw in another architectural debate about what will happen with architecture in the context of climate crisis, and modernism or a dream of new modernism was brought to the table many times. Yes, but we are already also, after criticizing modernism a lot, we will also show those many facets of modernism today. So it's also good to come back to modernism to show how complex it was and how different were the stories of specifically women who joined this movement. I'm planning this evening this way that we'll speak for about 1 hour altogether, and then we'll have some room for questions. So please think and whatever catches your attention and interests. There will be also space for some Q&A at the end, and we'll be happy to if you can join our conversation as well. Having said that, I'm very happy to have you both here, and we'll also use your expertise to show other heroines, yes, that were present at this moment. But for a little while, I will just come back to Helena Syrkus and Barbara Brukalska. The reason they appear is that Małgorzata Jędrzejczyk and I are working towards an exhibition about them. But what is very interesting for us, and this is the context for my first question, is that putting them together shows very different strategies of how women entered architectural scene, architectural education, how they made their careers in this very men-centered world in the 1920s, 1930s. So just to describe it shortly, Brukalska was using her design skills. Yes, she was following very closely what was happening in the SIAM, the work of Margareta Lichocki, for example. She was up to date and making some cutting-edge designs, while Syrkus, not being that much engaged in architecture or being engaged in architecture later, she made her way through some organizational work, yes, through writing, editing, translating, being involved in more, let's say, political way. So those are those two case studies, but maybe you'll see more different ways of how women architects brought their way into design in the 1920s and 30s.
Shall I start? Okay. Yeah. Does it work? I hope so. No, not yet?
Not really.
Okay.
You can exchange and
Shall
we'll
I
work with that.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, so thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation, and it's a very great pleasure to contribute to your Exercising Modernity program. Yeah, actually, it is a challenging question to take these two cases in a way as a point of departure for reflecting about, so to speak, sort of women architecture, women architects, and the way how we probably have to rethink about writing historiographies and sort of differently, architecture historiographies differently by looking also particularly into gender issues. So what crossed my mind immediately was also when you described these two paths or these two trajectories or these two, one could even strategies or tactics. So you can also just differentiate between the two. Probably these are tactics in a male-dominated a sort of system of architecture, how women tries to navigate, to find their path within these conditions. And when it comes to the case of Helena Syrkus, I think it's specifically interesting how she in a way applied her multi-talented constellations into this sort of particular conditions, where sort of Simon Syrkus, you know, the husband was the male architect, typical constellation. She sort of tried to find her place within these particular conditions and made certainly also quite a sort of adventurous and also successful career when you look into the history about sort of after actually in the post-war conditions, how she was successful specifically under the constellations of this organization. So what crossed my mind was probably what also in some of these architectural historiographies reflecting women and gender constellations was also that this probably third path, if you want to, where actually female architects were then more engaged with, so to speak, what seems to be a dominated female sphere, like so to speak, building schools, building infrastructure, being engaged more into questions of private sphere, sort of floor plans. So I think an example is, for example, Carola Bloch, with her kindergartens that she designed in post-war years. I think one could even talk about, and I think she will reappear also here, about Vera Meyer-Waldeck and her sort of architectural career, a former Bauhaus student, or when we think about others. When you look in these particular ways, you might identify a particular trajectory that might sort of find its way, and some architectural historians like Hilde Heinen would call this is the contributionist historiography about how women get engaged into into this architecture. But this contributionist historiography might also have its pitfalls because it describes female architects mostly dominated by or operating in a very male-dominated realm. So that could be then again be questioned, this kind of writing history, when we look only into this from this perspective of how female architects contribute in a male-dominated field. So we might discuss later on also a bit more about what kind of, in a way, lessons we learn and how we probably have to also rewrite sort of this part of architecture history when it comes to shed light much more about gender conditions and looking into these difficulties, how women tries to enter this field and how to make their own careers. When it comes back to these particular figures like Helena Syrkus or actually Barbara Brukalska, there's certainly also something what also architectural historians would criticize or would at least ask us to reflect upon, that as certainly these pioneering women had also often a privileged position. So where they came from, what kind of social background they had, what kind of educational trajectories they had in order to enter actually this sphere. And I think this is often also forgotten when it comes to this sort of pioneering historiography. But this also has to be taken into account when we talk about these different facets, how we try to find a way how women find their path in architecture history.
And you researched, for example, Polish students coming to Bauhaus. Did it also come from different backgrounds, or because just like adding up to what Regina said about certain positions that made it easier for women architects to enter the architectural field? Did you feel that in your research about Polish architects, but also in general?
No, I can't say that, and I just want to remind you that Syrkus and also Brukalska, they were exceptional, and that were exceptional paths of life, and they were absolutely not normal. Most women fulfilled their role as a married woman, and they got children, and even if they were together with an artist and husband, even if they contributed to his work or did also their own work, it was not their aim, their role to be protagonists of avant-garde movements. I think, yeah. So if I may, I'd like to show some examples to make it more clear. And I felt that it was my role to answer the question, women architects and designers from the Bauhaus in an international avant-garde networks, question mark. So for instance, one of the Polish students that came to the Bauhaus was Gitel Golde. She was born in Bielsk-Podlaski to Jewish background and well-off family and also well-educated. She went to Vilna to the Applied Art School where she met Moshe Barhelfer, and then Moshe Barhelfer went to Dessau and she followed 2 years later. So here we have them together at the Bauhaus in Dessau. That means to go as a woman alone 1,000 kilometers away to an unknown art school, that would have been very, very unusual. So it was more common to follow their partner or their husband and to study there. And so far we don't know anything about her work, although she was trained as a graphic designer at the Bauhaus Dessau for 2 years. They fled to Paris and they survived, but Moshe Barhelfer was the renowned artist later. But we still haven't, we don't have any dissertation on Moshe Barhelfer, so it is still also to discover his work. Then another one, Charlotte Brandt, also Jewish family, well-off family. She was pursuing an artistic career, maybe also to the dislike of their family, because she was kind of an outlaw, and she moved on to Barcelona, to Rome, to London, and she did watercolors like this one, maybe influenced from Picasso, by Picasso. She also contacted Picasso, so she was in an international network, but she never was a prominent figure, and nobody knows her. She had to emigrate to New York. She became tuberculosis, and then she died under very miserable conditions in the Bronx in New York. So although she had this contact, she also had contact to Gropius in New York. She never regained success and is unknown until today. So yeah, I can show more biographies maybe later, but
yes, but it's
to show the normal ways of women, unknown, and housewives.
Probably it's now the work of art historians and architecture historians, yes, to dig out those stories. Sometimes we know just a photo, sometimes we know just only that someone studied somewhere. I think because you mentioned that Barbara's Brukalska and Helena Syrkus are quite exceptional, but being like those very strong women, it's also probably a question of time and how how the narration about them changed, yes, because they were very strong from the beginning, but they also worked in those married couple, yes. So they had this both worked with their husbands, and that was one of the ways, yes, to to become active as architect or designers, at least in Poland. How it was in Germany, it was also like that.
Yeah, I was wondering a little bit in regards to this particular conditions of the 1920s, and we are now here surrounded also a little bit by this wonderful exhibition about the liberalization in terms of voting. Women were allowed to vote, so they stopped being free, and taking into consideration also this kind of the phenomenon of the new women under the circumstances of the Weimar Republic, and this particular sort of media image that was in a way sort of disseminated, and was certainly represented also by a certain elite of boheme and avant-garde, but still I would at least disseminate it also via this kind of media images within the wider population. And when you look into the discourses about actually femininity or gender roles in the Bauhaus, sort of ideas about androgyny or gender roles are becoming more and more sort of also apparent in this particular school. So what I'm trying also to at least sketch out a little bit is also that so this awareness of transformation, of radical changes when it comes to gender roles in the particular circumstances of the 1920s in Germany, and then specifically in this particular avant-garde circles, is something that has to be taken into account probably as role models, just as images, but still had an impact on the self-understanding of women. And that sort of brought me back to Helena Syrkus, a little bit more about her, that she conceived herself as an equal to men, as an avant-garde person. That meant something. If you consider yourself as an avant-garde person and didn't sort of constructed herself as something special, at least what I've learned from her biographies, which I found quite interesting. So this self-image, the self-projecting, even though probably the circumstances were different, but with this kind of consciousness, you know, being different, sort of also taking this role or provoking this. And we can compare it as even to some of the more famous Bauhaus female figures like Otti Berger, quite, you know, critically, quite sort of being self-conscious about her position as an artist. So, and so far I think, you know, this kind of climate and this kind of very short moment in history of these shifting conditions that allowed women broader access into the society and also radically sort of challenging actually the given conditions seems to me also, and this is back to the conditions of modernity, cultural conditions of modernity, social conditions of modernity seems to me quite crucial to take also into account.
Just to put feet into the doorstep, yes, in a way. Yes, but it was, as Anke mentioned, and you mentioned also earlier, they still had to find ways to using some tools that were probably more connected with this feminine side. Yes, so for example, Helena Syrkus ended up in first in the international in the CM, yes, in the international congresses of modern architecture. She ended up as a vice president in 1939, but in 1949. But she started as a secretary. Yes, so like that was a role that was described like associated with women. Yes, so that was her way. But Barbara Brukalska, on the other hand, she had a very brief moment of adopting this. Modernist outlook, yes. So she like very characteristic hat and hairstyle and so on. It was a brief moment, but this is actually the only image that circulates of her, and this is how people until now remember her and think of her. So. Even if there was this turmoil and those shifting positions, they have to somehow go through those feminine paths, let's say, yes, in some way.
Yeah, but then again, as a cultural historian, I would at least also claim, looking back into the sort of also economic conditions of Weimar Republic after World War I. So women were engaged in jobs, also they were working because the men were on the front, so they had. So they had to earn money for their families, so meaning there is already a shift in the roles that they were, in a way, even to a certain extent economically independent, and they had to do the jobs of men because of the war, and it has changed also their own sort of conditions of living. So there's me moving away from the housewife conditions because of that particular post-war or even war experiences. So I mean, it did change also in terms of the economical and social position, at least I would say in the metropolitan conditions that might be different the rural one, because I think this image of the new women is not coming out of nowhere, but it was really a kind of also a particular result of this historical specific historical conditions, and then entering actually the sphere of jobs like secretary or sort of stenotapist, those kind of jobs that were sort of existing sort of in this kind of new employments of a more service-oriented economy. This was also an entry door for even a sort of women that were not married, that sort of their way of life on their own. So those kind of careers were possible for a short period of time, certainly. No? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I asked myself during the preparation of this talk, which role did the fact play that they were from Jewish descent? And I mean, they always had to struggle, they had to fight for being educated, or was this more an obstacle, or was this also promoting their career because they were more courageous to take up positions nobody else had before? I don't know what.
Maybe more obstacles make you stronger as a person, and then you.
Yeah.
Yes, but I'm happy you mentioned that because this is something we already started to do, that to make this image of women in architecture more nuanced. Yes, because I think the general problem in art history and in this popular art history is that we tend to describe women as a group, and just to try to find for them like one recipe, yes, how they worked as architects or designers in the 1920s and 30s. But this was much more nuanced. We already mentioned different social backgrounds, different ethnical background as well. And that had also a huge impact on their different careers. Yes, so first we already said about entering the world of architecture, but how do you see with, for example, the architects and the designers you mentioned, how did their personal background influence their appearing in the architecture scene or disappearing from the architecture memory? Do you see it had an important role?
I can't. Sorry, I didn't really get your questions. Can you please?
No, I'm just wondering if the fact that they, because for example, the examples you showed, yes, those women came from different places, different ethnical backgrounds, different social backgrounds, and once they made their way into a professional field, it was one of the factors, this personal background, that helped them or made it more difficult for them?
No, it helped them. And all the examples we find at the Bauhaus, they all came from educated, middle-class families. And I don't know any woman that came from a workers' family. For instance, I have another one. No, doesn't go. No.
No, this is something else. Oh no.
Oh, sorry again. Sorry. Marianne Brandt, another Brandt, but with DT, and yeah, she did these famous metal objects in the Bauhaus. She was at the Bauhaus for over 7 years, so she was a highly regarded metal designer, and she deeply involved in the Bauhaus community, and she was she took photographs, she staged herself, and everybody would have thought, so after this she would have a famous international career, but the opposite was the case, and she could succeed a little bit at Ruppel in Gotha, but then the Nazis took over power. She had to take care for her parents, and in the end she was really miserable, and she died very poor, under very poor conditions in Chemnitz, and never had the chance to do these works again, like at the Bauhaus. So the Bauhaus was not the starting point, it was the best time of her artistic career.
And one should add to this particular biography that she lost also this avant-garde network, meaning so she was out of the circle of the prominent male figures, and that needs to be really sort of highlighted, because we do remember a letter from 1938 where actually Walter Gropius wrote to Marianne Brandt, and this is a story that we collected during an international conference in 2019 where we are asking about objects dispersed, so how actually various international Bauhaus exhibitions were based on particular, again, relationships, networks, and very very complicated provenances and constellations. So and this was a moment in 1938 where actually the prominent figures of the Bauhaus, male figures, Walter Gropius, Herbert Bayer, Anke knows this exhibition very well, was held in the MoMA in New York, and Gropius, under these particular circumstances, was trying to get at least originals, objects from the Bauhaus, in order to make actually the Bauhaus again big in this new conditions of his new homeland, the US, and presenting his school sort of for the American public. And he wrote a letter to Marianne Brandt and asking for some of those wonderful metal vessels. And she sort of responded and said, well, yeah, I have a few, but for me it's quite important. These are the only ones that you send it back. And these objects never came back. So they are now in the collection of the MoMA, and it gives you a little bit of an idea, and then there are many other sort of histories also of how women are wiped out. Bauhaus women were wiped out from history. Lucia Morley is the worst case, actually, where actually then also this kind of Marianne Brandt actually is such a key figure. Her objects were there, but she was in a way not present. Physically not, because she was in Chemnitz under those circumstances of Nazi Germany. And in second one, she was not powerful and tough enough to reclaim also these objects from this collection and ask for that she needs it back. So it was again this dominant, and there's a letter that I think Magdalena Droste also sort of cited later on, where Marianne Brandt really wrote that I feel so small in regard to your prominent career, where she felt almost sort of totally isolated. So she lost this network. She was quite dependent on it due to her particular sort of tragic situation, but at the same time, no support from the other side. And I think this is also something very important, and this is a typical example of this male-dominated networks. And as an opposite, which I found quite interesting, this is Margarete Leischner. She sort of exiled also, so she went into exile in London, and she was always under the umbrella of these prominent figures, or the male figures were again in London for 3 years. She made her own trajectory, totally independent from them. And she was super successful after, actually, so from the 40s and 50s onwards, as a textile designer. So in many companies, she was really, really a particular figure. She was then also teacher at the Royal College of Arts, totally independent from actually this network. So sometimes one can ask for networks could be also very oppressive if they are male dominated. No? So this is also something we have to take into account.
But they also can become very helpful, yes, at some points, especially at very turbulent points, and we can focus on that for a moment, because you already started, like when you were telling the biographies, for example, about of Marianne Brandt, you mentioned what happened with her later in life, and we started talking about 1920s and 1930s, but most of those women we mentioned lived in 30s, 40s, 50s, where the situation in whole Central Eastern Europe became very, very complex politically, and they had to take different sides. So I wanted to ask you about that now. Also, the architects who are both Syrkus and Brukalska are good case studies here, but we can refer to them later, and maybe you can also tell a little bit about those different, like whether those networks they had or they, how they were able to use them in these turbulent times. Were they supportive, or were just, as with Marianne Brandt, completely useless? How was it?
Well, I think you have to look at each case individually, and I mean, to become a housewife, to become a mother was still the most common life path, and so they rather tended to give up their artistic career than to follow their paths. I mean, these were the exceptions. Well, we have Ise Gropius, and Ise Gropius was, of course, extremely dependent on her husband, but he was also extremely dependent on her. And so she made the Bauhaus, and she made the network to her case, and she was the one who wrote the letters. She followed him wherever he went, and yeah, so that's how the Bauhaus was made, so to speak. couldn't live without each other, and they were happy to be in London, and then that Gropius got the invitation to teach in Harvard. That was, of course, so a great opportunity.
Yes, and for me, it's her case is very interesting because Gropius's and Syrkus's are kind of parallel stories, but on the different sides of Iron Curtain. And you can see, comparing them, you can see how different the life can go when you have like different starting points, but also different political situation that is not completely dependent on you. Yes, I mentioned already Syrkus, yes, who we mentioned she was starting from secretary to vice president of SIAM. She made her, she put her feet into the doorstep, yes, and she entered those international networks. They became very useful in the times of in the wartime, yes, when, for example, Syrkus was arrested and a prisoner at Auschwitz. She wrote to all her friends with whom she was constantly in touch, and tried to use this network as well to help rescue her husband. But it was interesting for me to see, because you can observe how those networks work when you see the correspondence, and actually they survived the war, but they broke when the communism came, yes, and Syrkus and Helena Syrkus in particular decided to become one of the faces of communist regime in Poland, yes. So all the networks collapsed immediately. But and we have probably more cases from the region who were also positioning themselves on different sides, yes, of the regimes.
Yes, of course. I have to think about Erich Schwanz, I think. He came to Warsaw, and his wife was the director of the Warsaw Gallery, the art gallery, Gisela Schwarz. Yeah, in the 60s. So that was she was the director, and he was, so to speak, in her. Yeah, she made the career, and he was working as an architect, and well, they had to leave because of the 60s and the anti-Semitism in the 60s in Poland. So they arranged themselves with the communism, but this was the starting point of emigrating to Germany again.
Yeah, and probably to add, I think now again Marianne Brandt comes into the view, because actually also based on the other network of Mats Dam and so to speak the emigres that came back from the Soviet Union, there was a little small window in 1945-46 in Dresden, where this Institute for sort of Industrial Design has been formed by Mats Dam, and I think this was very much also governmental project, at least in this short period of time. And then Marianne Brandt was also invited to teach there. So, and then she could build actually again on this network that has existed among actually at least a particular sort of cluster of avant-gardists, and sort of being invited for this Dresden Institute. And I think this was again a very important step for her career, sort of at least under the circumstances of not yet Iron Curtain, but actually under the circumstances of the Soviet occupation zone. Although this experiment lasted very brief due to the shifting circumstances and political circumstances in Eastern Germany, but it was at least a moment where those kind of experiments could happen, connected and also to Dresden-Hellerau. So insofar there are, again, I would even say, I mean, networks are not stable, and I think this is also from your earlier research project, what is moving networks, is a quite important sort of term probably to think about, that, so to speak, some of those members of those networks are moving again into other conditions, and then they get reformed and reformulated and sort of again re-established under these new circumstances. And I think so far we have to take also this processuality into account. And another example, I think Vera Meyer-Waldeck will come into the view very soon. She in a way then benefited, or at least, yeah, she could really sort of gain access for sort of her further career as a quite prominent architect in sort of post-war Western Germany due to the German Werkbund and its trajectory. So we have again another organization. So she was very much engaged, for example, in the Interbau in Berlin. Not far from here. So did exhibition design for that. She was also she designed a couple of buildings for actually for the federal sort of Germany government and Bonn. So she was quite a key figure. No? Then when you look at her career, and she started at the Bauhaus as a carpenter. No?
Yeah.
She was the only
Here
sort of
you can see her
so
in the carpentry.
as the carpentry. Yes. She was the only sort of female carpenter, by the way. And I think that's also something where you see she also in a way exploited, so to speak, also this kind of existing already networks also, and it was very helpful for her later career under the federal German, Western German sort of society.
But I think she was one of the only architects from the Bauhaus who became successful after 1945.
Lotte Stambese.
Lotte Stambese, yeah,
Quite
in the Netherlands. Yeah,
super
of course.
important. And I think this example I wanted also to bring up.
Yeah, but again, this is exceptional and not the rule.
But Lotte Stambese is insofern interesting, sorry again for jumping in, because actually she might also sort of shed light on the fact that probably specifically female architects enter the realm of public housing, urban planning, urban design, so moving away from the object-centered architecture understanding towards a broader understanding. So she was a key town planner in Rotterdam, so a quite important figure actually specifically in this realm of town planning. So they enter other fields as architects, and I think that is probably interesting for discussing writing architecture historiography from the perspective of female architecture, and that these sort of opening up the field towards other sort of forms of engaging, specifically also socially. I think that is something we have to also probably can discuss later.
Yeah, also for kindergarten and toys and children's rooms, and both of them, I think.
So to see them not only as this feminine field they occupy, but also a chance they bring to the architectural field as
expanded the architecture field. And I think that is quite important. As moving away from the Bauhaus, when you look into Catherine Bauer and her role for public housing in the US, it's also something how history is written. There's this famous exhibition in 1932 at the MoMA, Modern Architecture International Exhibition. What we know about is mainly these iconic architectures from the European that has been presented there. But there was another part in this exhibition, and this was about public housing in the US, curated by Catherine Bauer. So she was a totally different figure, was then also quite sort of close to Ruth Mumford. And I think her history is now also sort of unpacked by a couple of architectural historians, and it sheds light really on her engagement. The US in public housing seems quite a contradiction, but it was. There were a lot of programs running about, and those women were quite engaged specifically in this field, and this links us to the Bauhaus person, Lotte Stambese, where you see this expansion of the field of architecture.
It's a very nice shift of perspective, because in this popular way of speaking about architecture is a kind of feminine field they are associated with, but seeing it as a next kind of expansion, it changes the way we tell about it. And I thought about another cliché that it's there, and that comes when you, for example, tell about the history of Marianne Brandt, who almost disappeared. Yes, there's even this wonderful work by her in the collection of the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation that is called Unknown. Bekannte and Bekannte, something like that. So she made a little collage out of Verrocchio's painting, showing herself as someone who was known, but everyone thinks even that she passed away, yes, because they haven't heard about her for a while, yes, and she also almost felt that she disappeared from this scene. So the cliché I'm referring to is that those who stayed on the western side of Iron Curtain, they had like a lot of possibilities to develop their careers, and the eastern side not really. But it's, if you look closely, it's not really true, yes, because just the architectural, the conditions of being architect changed. There were those huge state offices, yes, but women were still very present there. So how was with, for example, East Germany in this sense?
With the female architects, yeah, I mean, the architecture was the last area where women could gain power and could get visible. It was more they were successful in weaving or ceramics or whatever, but architecture was the last area of the men, I think.
Okay. I'm just thinking if we maybe if we just try to write this history or look more closely, yes, on this Eastern European part, maybe it will also turn out that became like that there were just like different ways, yes, of being active.
Yes, sure. I think that it needs to be also taken into consideration that this model of sort of architecture, sort of running a private office or being a freelance architect under the circumstances of the Eastern Germany, and I think it was a bit similar in Poland. I'm not sure about it, but the larger sort of companies, state-owned companies that also existed. This was then occupied by female, but also by female and male architects. So when you look into for example, the enrollment of architecture students in the GDR, like at the TU Dresden, or actually in Weimar at the school in the HAB, the School of Architecture and Building. So there were certainly also a lot of women studying architecture, but one could say that the authorship question under those circumstances of the Eastern Bloc architecture production was a complicated one, to frame it sort of gently. So it was really a complicated one. There are only a few names that were certainly sort of known, but in general, big, large sort of offices but offices that are mainly state-owned were running that. So, although I would not assert here to say there was no architect under East German conditions, but I think the question of authorship was very different to the Western or so the liberal model of the architect, and even as a male figure. So this and I think this would be also a question or a field of discussion in general, authorship questions in terms of architectural history, because architectural history is often similar to art history, written alongside actually the idea of authorship. So meaning there is an author and there is a building and there is a certain sort of articulation of forms, and there is a sort of an object-centered sort of history that is very much aligned with the epistemologies of art history. And I think a lot of architectural historians, specifically also coming from a gender perspective, would now claim we have to consider architecture differently. So as an open and very complicated field where many actors are involved with. So it's not a lonely field of one figure that is making a building, but rather than it's a complex field of production where the construction side is in, the engineers are in, the statics people are in. There are so many different, there's an economy in, there are clients in. Yeah, so you have to expand the field of architecture, and then you can write the architecture history differently. And then immediately you see a lot of women in this field. And probably coming back to Eastern Germany, maybe in this kind of sort of collectives that produced certainly sort of infrastructure, school buildings. there were a lot of female, but they are not visible. And this is also a problem of, again, East German architecture historiography that needs to be now unpacked and unraveled.
Yeah, and also in West Germany, I mean, we are still discussing the work of Lili Reich and the things she really did, and she can be accredited for in this creative work with Mies van der Rohe, and for him it was important to be mentioned, and I think she was modest and she didn't see the need to claim her work, and yeah, so it's still.
So it's also a way that bringing gender perspective can, in which bringing gender perspective can actually change the field of architecture history. Yes, just to yes, I mentioned in the case of Helena Syrkus and Barbara Brukalska, I mentioned those cooperation with their husbands in the 20s and 30s, which is also. It doesn't actually. Sometimes it doesn't matter who actually did. Yes, they did it together. Yes, and but also in the post-war times, they were, of course, those very strong characters and active in the teaching field. For example, in the Warsaw Faculty of Architecture, but also somehow trying to find their ways in this state. In the system of state-run offices, yes. So this is also a part of their history that it's now waiting to be written. And before I open the discussion to our wonderful public, I wanted to ask you about your roles and the roles of institutions in rewriting this history. How we can now bring back those women who were very present in very different roles, what institutions can do to expand this field and change this perspective.
Yeah, I mean, we are trying to change this perspective, and yeah, you mentioned already our database, Bauhaus Community, where you can research all women and all men who we can connect to the Bauhaus, and I mean, this gives us the opportunity to research the history anew of the Bauhaus, because now we have the names, and let's see what they did. And yeah, in 2021 I had the chance to curate with Patrick Rössler the exhibition Forgotten Bauhaus Women, Life Paths in the 30s and 40s, and there we shed light on these really poor artists, women artists that really struggled and tried to fight their way, but in the end their fates were really tragic, and mostly ended tragically. And yeah, but this is our way to show the life of the ones that couldn't establish, couldn't build an archive, and couldn't yeah, enter the museum because we don't have any documents and we don't have any works.
Yeah, and probably from our side, Bauhaus Dessau Foundation. So we tried, for example, also in the in our collection presentation with the new Bauhaus Museum, which was opened in 2019. So it's a different approach that avoids the centrality of the three male figures, the three directors, but rather than shows the school as a living organism where many different voices sort of reappear actually in the collection. A lot of students' voices, students' works are also presented. And we used also the approach of an entangled history, where actually also this kind of networks and sort of relationships with various different figures plays a major role. And we also have on a small scale a biographical approach where, for example, Marianne Plant plays a major role, but also other female figures that we sort of put into the fore, avoiding actually, and what we call the decentering of the Bauhaus, so moving a little bit away from sort of considering these Bauhaus narratives as a core, but rather than contextualizing it, embedding it into a much broader, again, network of different avant-garde institutions where the Bauhaus was deeply interwoven with and connected with, and also sort of its success story after actually the Bauhaus was closed wouldn't have been in such a case when this kind of networks didn't exist. So this this shifting perspective, not as a linear story, but rather than as a story of various different overlapping movements and mobilities and trajectories and personal paths. That was one of the agenda of the actually curation, which I had the pleasure also to be part of this particular display of actually our collection in this new museum. And then yes, certainly we try also with our intermezzi to focus and to highlight in certain sort of female figures that have been overlooked or overseen and are now part of our collection. So for it, there is a need for, but at the same time, I think what is accompanying that, and that's what we were discussing, is then also moving away from particular modes of historiographies. I think is challenging in terms of race and gender. So we have really to shift sort of and to change actually this mode of writing history. And I think this is a continuous task and a continuous agenda for many cultural institutions that have such collections, and to revisit also their heritage with new perspectives and new lenses.
Yeah, but I think the danger is to try to rewrite history as an equal history, and it will never be an equal history, and we have to acknowledge the disadvantages.
And this is then also part of that. The other side of the danger is victimization. No? So that's what we should also definitely avoid. And the only chance is to see, this kind of entangled constellations and how they made their fortune and how, under what circumstances. So this contextualization seems very crucial.
But I like very much this conclusion that bringing women architects to the table actually expands the fields of architecture, that expands the way we look at architecture, but also brings many, by bringing them and bringing the very specific cases and being aware of the specificity, we can also see many minor figures in the field that are equally important but never described. Yes. So with this, I will be very happy to. Yes, we have some questions from the audience.
I find it really interesting what you said, how to avoid victimization of female architects, for example. But on the other hand, you mentioned Marion Brandt, which was actually actively disowned by Walter Gropius. And actually, it was not the only one case. Maybe there was not like the central feature of Bauhaus. She was not a student, but the history of Lucia Moholy-Nagy was actually exactly the same, but it goes even further because she had capacity and courage to go against Gropius, but it still didn't work for years. Like, she had to really actively fight for her ownership, like for her creation actually. So maybe it's also another perspective, like between heroization and victimization, to really look at the agency with which male participants of these movements disowned women. So it was not just unfortunate circumstance that it just happened that they are forgotten, but it was also quite often actively made that they are not known nowadays.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I tried already to describe it as such, this kind of sort of wiping out of the history by these prominent male figures. And to be honest, when you look into the letters from actually the later times in the US, when Gropius and had this exchange with Moholy-Nagy and then also with Albers, and this constant sort of attempt to dominate and patronize actually his own view on the Bauhaus, together with his wife, by the way. So this is not nice. So you think then, my goodness, so there's really an attempt, he becomes really Mr. Bauhaus, and this was an attempt also to focus this particular historiography very much on him, and the narrative we own is very much still this canon, no? So that is described by him in his publications, and so it's a Gropius narrative, and I think since couple of years all these Bauhaus institution tries really to unravel actually this Bauhaus narrative and to multiply it, to integrate various voices, to show it as a very contested and a very vibrant field of interpretations, of misunderstandings, of controversies, and I think then it becomes lively. But there are, again, this is an uneven field, there are power positions, Gropius has a chair at in Cambridge and Harvard, so some others were not in such a position and to contribute to this historiography. So we have to be also very careful with what we got from the past, what kind of narratives, and how we have to rewrite them.
But like, I think it's also interesting, like the role of Isa Gropius, because I think you mentioned that she did it actively with Walter Gropius after the war. But for example, in my research, I also found some letters, like in 1976, after the first Bauhaus colloquium, where she basically posed herself as herself and Gropius as these figures who were actively taking care of everyone of this network, who were sending packages, and were looking also for people who went to the Soviet Union, people who stayed in Germany. But on the other hand, yeah, like this, in the context of these fights, for example, for the ownership or like the authorship of the works, it's also like, I don't know. It's just like, but I think it was nice what Alexandra said with these roles of Isa Gropius and Walter Gropius and Helena Syrkus and Szymon Syrkus in Poland. Maybe you could say something more about it.
I can expand on that. I actually, a few years ago, I edited the Helena Syrkus correspondence because in this sense she was a kind of parallel example to Isa Gropius because she ran Szymon Syrkus' office and also was an editor of Presence, so the magazine they released as a group Presence that was a Polish section of SIAM. But it's and so she had this role, but she made it very visible. To give it some much more context, when I traced, for example, Walter Gropius' correspondence, sometimes Isa Gropius was not seen there. Like she was the hands who wrote the letters, but was not like explicitly there. I even found one letter he wrote when he was already at Harvard, and he explained to his friends that he's sorry, I'm writing in English because my secretary doesn't know German, so that's why you know. So then you see these hidden women who are there. But Helena Syrkus was quite the contrary because. In the beginning, she wrote the letters and she signed them as Helena and Szymon. And at some point, she just took over the correspondence and became the mastermind, let's say, of that. And also, thanks to this very strong character, she made her position at the SIAM that she lost very abruptly when she became. She confirmed her. Engagement in the communist side, yes. So, but it was interesting to see also in this because Regina already said about this possible oppressiveness of networks. Yes, so it's also interesting to see that all those networks can have different like power dynamics, and they can also change in time. Yes, so in the context of Helena and Szymon, it's the network of SIAM that at the beginning was their homeland, let's say, and then a very supportive space when they struggled during the wartime, but then something that was they were cut off when they declared themselves as communists, but also the dynamics between them too changed. Yes, so this is also something that is very interesting to study in this specific biographical cases because there was a different dynamic between the two of them during 1920s, 1930s when Szymon Syrkus was the leading architect and she was his secretary. They made many architectural projects together, but he was really well regarded in the architectural scene, while after the Second World War, when he came back from Auschwitz in a very bad state, she became like the head of the family, yes, and her very strong character revealed itself fully after the war, and you can see that in many documents that she's actually making the decisions. Yes, so this is. It's interesting when you take specific case studies from, and also when you put them in a bigger perspective and also compare with others, that you can see that there are some some things that we experience, all of us experience. Yes, some shifts in the history, shifting borders, shifting geographies. So there are some patterns that you can see, but also there are so many trajectories that you can take. Yes, that even those patterns have many variations. Yes. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that Gropius was really supportive also with Isa. So it was not to give a false picture here. He was really supportive. He was really reliable, or both were really reliable. They were very much engaging and sending care packages to Germany and collecting money in the US. So I think if they really controlled the Bauhaus discussion, it was unconsciously. It was not that they wanted to be, so we are the Bauhaus and we have to control the reception of the Bauhaus, but yeah, more unconsciously. And in a way, they were really I would say good networks, because they really took serious their partners. They were interested in their life paths, and
or maybe it was also a result of some situation they were in. Yes, because when they migrated to US, they became the Bauhaus couple. Yes, so they were somehow put in this situation of becoming the the heads of the networks.
Yeah, they didn't have to fight to be the Bauhaus in opposite to Hannes Meyer, who always fought for his role in this avant-garde network.
Does anyone have a comment or question? Or yeah, there's
one. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I haven't been there from the very beginning, but from the moment I was there, it was already very, very interesting. I'm not a historian, I'm a practicing architect. And one topic that is, and I know the discussion is really much related to the history, but what is concerning me very much is the loop to the present and certain problems that I believe has changed, even though, because we often use this word women present, women visible, and I think in terms of this has definitely improved. We are present, we are visible, but the way the dynamics work in those networks, as you have also called it, this I think hasn't changed much, or I imagine it has changed very, very little. And there are just, at least from my perspective, a lot of glass ceilings that have been built and have been strengthened in the past years that kind of make it seem from the outside as if women have it much easier and everything, and there is no problem of those like gender inequality in architecture. But in fact, there is. It's just way less visible and much more hidden. And especially those networks, I found it interesting that the building process, I believe this is a set of networks and ongoing and wrapped, and a lot of actors present, and let's say being a woman in this in kind of playing within those networks is a particularly different task, and those obstacles are coming on different levels. So I would just like what I'm aiming at is only to kind of try to relate the history of the past with the history of the present, let's call it, because this is what we're writing right now, and I do define certain problems that are more and more difficult to nail, because it's easy to put women, for example, let's say, in the representations, but then not give them actual responsibilities. That is one thing. Another one is how many women are there actually in the leading positions, and then how does it actually feel when, let's say, a woman or a young woman has to talk to 5 building site managers, and like all those things are making it actually still a present topic. So that's my comment. Otherwise I just find it very interesting whatever had been said in the last 40 minutes that I'm here. So thank you very much.
Yeah, probably, but just to respond to your comment and to sort of really to connect actually this historiography question of how to rewrite actually architecture historiography and how to connect it with the contemporary concerns in regard to what is called Bauwende, so this totally sort of transformation of the field of architecture that is needed in order to respond to the planetary challenges that we are now facing. So it seems to me that there's a kind of a rediscovery of, one could say now it's this typical feminization of actually a specific gender engagement or gender agency in architecture. But so questions of care and household, for example, now completely redescribed, and they get a different connotation. So from the perspective of a household, as a oikos, you think totally different about the building, or from the perspective of care infrastructure, you think differently about architecture. And those kind of discourse is becoming super, super vibrant at the moment when it comes to how architecture as a discipline has radically to respond and to challenge, actually to challenge its own trajectories. And for that, actually, those kind of early pioneers like Catherine Beecher, so these women that were engaged in the totally reformulating the floor plans of households, that are fitting more into a logic, a different logic of sort of housekeeping and householding. So they get, beside their probably conservative sort of history, they get a new attention. And I think that's something that is also about this expansion of the field of architecture, where actually this gender perspective from multiple sort of facets of gender perspectives, so rather intersexuality or sort of gender perspectives is also essential to that. So there are many facets of that, but it seems to me that again, it's about rethinking totally about what is this architecture field about. And your example with the construction site is super essential. So this is often not part of the architectural historiography to think about the construction site, but then immediately the earth comes in. The technology comes in, the many laborers, this sort of poorly paid labor force that is active on construction site comes in, and you see architecture differently. And I think that's probably that's why this kind of connection seems to me so important, beside actually the particular professional. But if you think the profession differently, then probably you get also another perspective of this field of agency of architecture.
I got a very practical question. I was always curious, how did it work? I mean, the context of this discussion, very interesting one, is the story about two Polish women architects. And we discussed it in our team many times. How did it work in Weimar Republic? So did German women study architecture? I mean, in Weimar Republic, because when we try to follow these paths of careers, yes. So it's of course this moment when you can do something, create, build, construct. But first is if you can study that. And as far as I remember, in this pre-war Poland, it was possible to study architecture for women. How did it work in Weimar Republic? This is a very simple and practical question, and I would, yes. I think there were 5 academies before 1919 where women could study at all. I mean, painting or sculpture, and I don't know if any TU technical university was really open to women before 1919. It was more or less art academies. From 1919 on, women could study everywhere and every subject, but of course there was this need to have certain certificates to enter the TU, for instance, and many women didn't have the Abitur or comparable certificate at that time. And you have to take into account that the architectural profession at that time was differently organized. You learned it by doing and not by studying. That was, and Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, they didn't have architectural diplomas. They learned it from working in an office or from their fathers. They had a journeyman's exam maybe, but it was no need to make an architectural diploma. There were no chambers, no architectural chambers. They were only established in the Nazi period, in the Reichschamber of Art, and then in 1945 or in the 60s, and then the architectural profession became the profession we know it today. So it was much more open how to become an architect, and for women to become architects it was much more difficult.
It's probably the task for the future, yes, just also to not only to think about this region as a whole, but also to see the differences between the particular countries, yes, how they were.
Because they could meet their husbands, they could create together, because the story of Polish architects, women architects, is they are, most of them are together with husbands, yes? Maria and Kazimierz Piechotkowie and Syrkusowie.
Yes, they're always couples. Yes, but couples who met during studies. So that's why it was important for that in Warsaw. That was the way of getting this. They studied, but actually most of them get their architecture degree like sometimes later. Yes, so like Syrkus just had several years of architectural studies and then got her diploma in 40s. So it was. Much later, yes, but it's interesting to see it in a context. I also had an opportunity to because now we are talking about countries or spaces about Eastern Europe that is politically has similar political history. Yes, so here the moment when women got voting rights, for example, was more or less similar. Yes, but if you get even bigger context, it's very interesting to see that there were some places that it was even worse that now seem surprising. I had an opportunity to participate in writing an encyclopedia of women architects that will hopefully come up someday, but that was launched by editors from US and started from the 60s. So because that was their reality, and then when they expanded to the whole world, it turned out that every continent, every country has a totally different starting point for women history in architecture.
And also for the avant-garde.
Yes?
I think this is also pretty interesting, because I believe that this mythos of an architect's couple is driven up until today, really, and it's still believed. If there is obviously a couple can do more than two, but that was another layer added on to that. And I'm not a historian. I'm wondering how many of those successful or semi-successful or kind of visible women were in couple with another architect, male architect, and how many of them were not in couple with an architect. And I think this makes it, because this is really running up until today. If you're in a couple with an architect, everybody believes immediately you're supposed to succeed much faster, and it's a myth, and it's also it does carry a lot of burdens and a lot of exactly as those networks, yeah, bads and goods, and it should not be idealized, and it should not be carried on, in my opinion.
And it can also have a bad side, like in the case of Dennis Scott Brown, yes, who was equally active in her spousal couple, but only her husband got a Pritzker Prize. So this is yes.
Were any of those examples you presented today, any of those architects were not a wife or a partner of an architect, or were they most of them?
I mean, Vera Meyer-Waldeck, she wasn't married, I think. Lotte Stambese was, of course, married with Mart Stam before. Annegret Wimmer, yeah, I think she also was married, but she wasn't that successful. Yeah,
sometimes
it's difficult. Yeah,
it's difficult, and sometimes it's also a struggle how you later write about those women architects. Yes, because you can tell the story of this couple and their common designs, but you can also try to separate them somehow, and this is what I try to do. And I was also maybe not criticized for that, but it was surprising for many researchers that when I published the book of Helena Syrkus correspondence, I wrote that it's Helena Syrkus correspondence, not their joint. Yes, so and this was not like purely architectural part of her work. Yes, so there are some difficulties for historians later on, yes, how to approach those couples. But I can also think of some, from the Polish context, some couples who were couples of architects but work independently, like Halina Skibniewska and Zygmunt Skibniewski. They were active in the 50s, 60s, 70s, but it was also the case of a very strong women who were also engaged in politics. Yes, so so they worked. They were a couple, but they didn't work together. Just shared the profession. So this was also a possible scenario, but not that common.
I'm researching the life and work of Bauhaus student Max Krajewski, and his life is in this way interesting that he went to Soviet Union, and his story looked a bit different because, like in the Soviet Union, after the avant-garde, like after 1932, it was not anymore well seen, especially also like to be from abroad during the Stalinist time. He was married to Fanny Yakovlevna Belostotskaya. She was one of the first women who got the diploma in the Soviet Union, like as an architect. And actually, this was also the couple of architects, but in this way, his past in Bauhaus was not playing any role, and she was pushing this. She was basically pushing this both careers, and she made him survive in the Soviet Union. So I'm still working on it, but it's really interesting because it's completely the other way around than in so many cases which were described here. So when they met, she was actually the successful, young, promising architect in Soviet Union, and then she used her networks somehow for them both to survive.
So many stories, and we probably could go on like that. And but we hope to continue the conversations in more informal way. So thank you so much for joining us today and for your wonderful questions and comments. And thank you, Regina and Anke, for being with us and sharing your great knowledge. Thank you.